important. I don't know, perhaps, in the few minutes before Alberto joins here, I wonder if anyone has any reflections on the past workshops that you have attended, or perhaps any questions or what you're looking forward to learning today as part of the discussion on the regulatory and legal frameworks for independent system operators. So yeah, I guess it's an open forum. If anyone has any comments or questions regarding these topics, I'd love to hear more from you all, because I think up until now, we have just been speaking to you.
I can say something.
Please, Ignacio. Yeah.
I was yesterday in a meeting in London with many people from Africa. The topic of the conference, that was a two-day conference, was private investment in Africa, and half of the meeting was devoted to transmission. And I was asked to talk about the impact of regulation on transmission investment. And the message that I say, and that I will continue saying from the African School of Regulation, is that I think that we have a number of deficient regulation in transmission that make difficult the investment. And that has to do with regulators, and I've been a regulator. I've been a member of the Regulatory Commission in Spain and Ireland, and I've been a consultant in almost 50 countries, in many cases talking about transmission regulation. And something that happens is that instead of considering transmission as the simple activity that it is, which is to put pylons, to put wires on the pylons, to put insulators and some protection schemes. I'm an electrical engineer, I know what I'm talking about. And then receive a steady remuneration, annual remuneration per year for this activity for a long period of time, because the economic life of a transmission line is very long. Actually, it's forever, because you continue upgrading or replacing what is now worn out, and the line continues operation forever. I don't remember any transmission line that has been dismantled. So instead of that, regulators are very creative, and they think that transmission should be remunerated on the basis of the flows in the lines, which is something that the investor in a line from A to B have nothing to do with. So what you know very well, because you are people working in system operators, that the one who is responsible for the dispatch and how the flows go, up to a certain point is the system operator, because I mean, the flows depend on whether it is raining more in this place and this hydro reservoir is producing more, or if this power plant is in operation or not this day because it tripped yesterday because of some reason, or the demand has grown more in this area than that area. So the owner of the transmission link between A and B, and particularly cross-border interconnections, is not responsible at all for the flows along the line. But in many cases, and I would say that in all transmission lines in Africa, is remunerated on the basis of the flows. And also the remuneration is typically the regulators updated every year or every other years or sometime based on the replacement costs, instead of paying transmission for the costs that were incurred when the line was built. And so there are a number of things that happen in the regulation of transmission that make difficult for any investor, because investors smell risk. And if they see that the remuneration that they are going to have depend on what the technology will be in the future, or depend on how the flows in the line that they are going to build will be, they will not invest. And a sample of 10 African countries representative of the 54, very recent report showed that of all the investment that has taken place, private investment in Africa in the power sector, only 0.6% went to transmission or distribution. No wonder does not go to distribution, because distribution, all the distribution companies in sub-Saharan Africa are not financially viable, are broke. They get income that is less than the costs that they have, except for one, Umeme in Uganda, that happens that will be dismantled, decision of the government. And in transmission, there is one line that is now being considered and is close to close the financial arrangements in Kenya. And there is no investment in transmission, and it should be, because private investors happen in Latin America, happen in Europe, happen in the US, happen in India, but not in Africa. So I think that there is something important, that an important message that has to be sent to the regulators. And I've been one, and I feel concerned, and I am teaching regulation. I've been teaching regulation for 40 years in North America, Europe, and now in Africa. And I think that this is very important, because transmission is vital for the operation of the regional markets and the electricity markets, in the electricity systems in most sub-Saharan African countries are very small. I was last week in Sierra Leone, a peak demand 130 megawatts, and many countries have demands like that. In the more than 20 countries in sub-Saharan Africa have peak demands below 1 gigawatt. So it is impossible to have an internal market there. The only possibility of having a market and power exchanges and some competition is at regional level. And competition at regional level is only possible if you have enough transmission interconnection capacity, and that requires investment. And the countries have other priorities to spend the money, so they don't do the investment in transmission lines. And we need private investment, but we need to fix the regulation to have that, to reduce the risk that the own regulators have created. So I think that this is an important message, that, I mean, you are not in the regulation, you are more in the operation of the system, but I think that you feel that problem of lack of interconnection capacity, and how much better power trade and the operation and emergency conditions of your regional markets will be under with better, stronger interconnections. I've been designing the internal electricity market in Europe. I was one of the fathers, together with Alberto Pototschnig. We were visiting the different countries, presenting the model of that he's going to describe. And I've been involved in power pools in North America. I was co-designer of the regional market in Central America. So I know.
I had a very quick question before you
Yes.
wrap up. Are there examples of investment in transmission using the PPP framework that has been successful? Because
Yes.
the problem with the transmission is it's a natural monopoly. So bringing in private investors, it might probably have an upward impact on the transmission wheeling prices. So are there successes in using a PPP framework in attracting investments in transmission, especially in areas out of Africa?
Yes, I will put in the chat as soon as I will stop talking and Alberto will start talking. I will put a couple of links of 2 documents from the World Bank, very good documents on private investment in transmission. And I was, as I said yesterday, and they describe hundreds of lines that have been done in Latin America and in India, for instance, in several countries in Latin America, in Chile, in Brazil, in Peru, and others under the private power transmission model that is very clearly described in these documents, but it is a natural thing that happens in Europe and North America. So in Europe, in my country, Spain, a system operator was created in 1985, and there was a publicly owned company and several private ones, and the system operator was operating the entire system with private investors and public ones. And the same thing happens in other countries in Europe. In North America, it is normal that private investors build the lines that the system operator is planning. Doesn't have to be the utility. That typically is also private. So private investment happens all over the place. And as I said before, I mean, I was talking with the Minister of Energy in Sierra Leone 1 week ago. And when I talked about private investment in transmission, he said, oh no, but investment in transmission has to be always public because of security reasons. Well, you know very well that this is wrong, because security in the power system depends on the system operator, does not depend on the owner of a piece of wire and some pylons, because the owner of transmission is not operating transmission. It's just making the transmission link available, and that's it. So yes, there are many examples, and I will put in the link in the chat the link to the 2 documents I'm talking about. And yesterday, I think you can see my you can see me, right? Okay. Yes. So I was talking about that yesterday, and then somebody brought this document to me. It's a company called Gridworks. You can see that.
No, we can't see that because of your background, but
oh yeah. Yes, okay. Yeah. I have to put the FaceTime disk view camera. I don't know what happens.
It's fine. Perhaps yeah, we can see that you were holding up a document. I see. So I see that Alberto, while you're working on that, Ignacio, I see that Alberto has joined us.
Okay. Okay. So this is, yeah, that was a document of a company that is supported by the development agency in the UK called Gridworks, and they are now, I think, involved in a potential private investment in transmission, and they had a document that is called Private Investment in Transmission, and they were basically making, I mean, talking about the same thing. So I will stop. I will give you the links in the chat.
Thank you so much, Ignacio. That was very helpful. And I want to acknowledge 2 things. One, I want to acknowledge that Alberto has joined us. Thank you so much, Alberto, for joining us. Apologies for the mix-up in timing. I also want to acknowledge that Boniseni had their hand up. So Alberto, are you able to get your slides up? And as you're doing that, perhaps we can take Boniseni's question. One last question.
Thanks.
Before we get
thanks,
started.
Mike.
Yep.
Thanks, Mike. I think for me, it's more, you know, outside of the what Ignacio was talking about, that in many instances, and being practical enough, many of these programs which my colleague has raised, this private-public partnership, they have worked in many of the European, the South American, and American. But what is it that is at the core that diminishes the appetite of private investment in African development? Because when you look at one, you have Southern Africa Power Pool that has been trying to get its feet around, but the appetite is left to utilities and countries themselves to deal with that. That is it that this private investment is interested on almost a finished product that they can inject their investment on rather than start right at the beginning, because one would expect that spaces like your transmission, if you are building it and you're cutting across a couple of countries, it requires political support, and the investment and the technical acumen required there will be extensive. So my question that I wanted to probably establish from Ignacio is to establish what is it really that is the main drive behind the deprivation of investment in African development in far as power systems is concerned.
Right. Well, I think that I should leave Alberto to make his presentation. I think that the reason that we have a public ownership of transmission has to do with tradition and has to do with history. And I have nothing to object to what has happened in the past. Typically, the utilities were vertically integrated, and transmission is one of the activities that are needed to supply electricity. You need generation, you need transmission, you need distribution, you need commercialization of the product, electricity, and transmission was one of the components of the service, and it was publicly owned as generation was publicly owned, etc. Now we have learned that it is possible to unbundle, and also we have learned that nothing happens if you have a system operator that is more or less independent, and that and you add to the investment, to the network that you add transmission assets that are owned by different entities that don't have to be necessarily the utility. And this is something that we have learned more recently. So the history brings public ownership, and the knowledge that we have now brings the possibility of private ownership without any harm to the security, and making possible that private financing could come to the help of the investment that is necessary in the power sector in Africa. And with that, I will pass the word, of course, to my colleague Alberto.
Thank you, Ignacio. All right, I would like to formally introduce Alberto Pototschnig, the Deputy Director of the Florence School of Regulation. Thank you so much for joining us, Alberto. I will let you introduce yourself in full and begin your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mike. And first of all, apologies for being very late, but I've been relying on our exchange more than on my agenda. And so I was having lunch, and I tried to return as quickly as possible. So apologies, and thanks a lot to Ignacio, who was able to fill in for me. And I think you've been privileged to hear from him. He's got a lot more experience than I have. And I mean, you had a good opportunity, but again, apologies, and I'll start straight away. In terms of ownership of transmission lines and transmission system operator, I have to say that at least in Europe, the situation is mixed. You have countries, and Spain and Italy comes to my mind, where and the UK, where the transmission system operator has been privatized, and it's a separate company from the other actors in the electricity value chain. So we don't really see a distinctions in Europe between transmission system operators which are publicly owned and those who are privately owned, at least when it comes to the way in which they are regulated. I hope that you can hear me, and if so, I will go straight away on my presentation. Yeah, okay, excellent. And it's about how you organize the system operation activities in a situation where you want to liberalize the country. And before I start, maybe something obvious, which is the fact that we are now talking about transmission system operator, which is operation, which is a different activities from the other in the electricity value chain. I'm sure you're aware of it. It was not clear until probably 20 years ago that that the sector could be run in this way. And I remember when I started to get involved in the electricity sector, the vertically integrated company were saying that if you separate transmission and generation, then this transmission system operator would not have the assets to run the grid, to run the system, at its disposal. And this contractual relationship between the transmission system operator and the generation assets for balancing purposes, for reserve purposes, wouldn't work. Well, now we have, I guess, 20 more years of experience of separating generation from transmission. It has actually worked. And why is what's the purpose, or what's the reason for separating? Is what you can do with the different segments in the electricity supply chain. There are some activities can be run in competition, and some others that can be run in as monopolies. And the problem is that, and unless you separate them, unless you introduce some sort of unbundling, the monopolist activities could influence and could distort competition in those segments of the sector where this is possible. And therefore, going back to my example of 25 years ago, the transmission system operator could distort competition among generators. And that actually can happen at three different levels. First of all, the transmission system operator could try to have, if still part of a vertically integrated utilities, could try to have many more costs assigned to its activities than to other parts of the vertically integrated utilities, especially those in competition. In that way, to try to recover this cost through the tariff, because transmission will be a regulated business and therefore its costs covered by tariffs, and at the advantage of the generation sister company in the same vertically integrated utility, which would then be able to compete more favorably in the market. So this is one dimension, the cross-subsidization when it comes to tariff setting. The other one is discrimination in access conditions, and a transmission system operator may discriminate competitors vis-a-vis its own sister companies operating in generation when it comes to the conditions, the terms and conditions at which they can access the system. And the third point of discrimination is in network development. The transmission system operator may be tempted to develop the network in such a way to favor its sister company involved or operating in transmission to the detriment of competitors. So these three, and maybe there are more, but at least these three aspects suggest that some form of strong unbundling should be put in place between network activities, so transmission and distribution system operators, and the competitive activities to make sure that there is a level playing field in competition where this is possible. And therefore the separation, and beyond that, you also need to have third-party access to the essential facility, to the networks. Different forms of separation have been proposed and sometimes implemented gradually. In this scheme, I've outlined them from the less stringent to the more stringent, going from the outside to the inside of this picture. So I think it's pretty straightforward, and I will try to go through them very, very quickly. The first one is accounting separation, which means that the regulated and non-regulated business, they would need to have separate accounts, so that the regulator, when it sets the tariff for the regulated business, can do it on the basis of the cost of the regulated business and not of the cost of other parts of the still vertically integrated undertaking. So the aim is clear. The aim is to try to apportion the cost correctly to the different activities and avoid cross-subsidization of competitive activities, to the detriment of competition. And the main challenge is actually located of common and joint costs. For example, typically a conglomerate would have a single legal department, and then the issue is how you apportion the cost of this legal department or any staff services. How do you apportion to make sure that they are not disproportionately apportioned to the regulated activities to the benefit and of the other sister companies in the same conglomerate. The second one is functional separation, which is also about decision making. And here the purpose is to try to avoid that decision taken by the transmission system operator activities are taken to the benefit of, again, the sister companies operating in generation, for example, and to the detriment of the competitors in this segment. What is the main challenge? Well, it's whether you could really have independence of management when they are still part of the same company in this case, because we're not talking about still legal unbundling, we're talking only about management separation. So they're still part of the same company, and then you pretend them to act independently, even vis-a-vis to the other departments in the same company. So, and then you need to have some segregation of information, Chinese walls between the different activities, and that also, you know, could be difficult to enforce. I will come later on to an example of a sort of a type of this type of separation, which is available in Europe, but it's a bit of a nightmare. The next level is legal unbundling or legal separation, where you basically require regulated and non-regulated activities to be run by separate companies, so separate legal entities. And here, this is a slightly stronger form of unbundling than functional unbundling, because now we have separate companies, but they still respond to the same owners or ownership. So at the end of the day, the management of the network company may feel somehow under pressure to try to favor the sister companies operating generation, because, as I said, at the end of the day, they respond to the same owners, and the challenges are the same. You know, how can you ensure independence of management and to implement also and enforce sort of Chinese walls? So the stricter form of unbundling is ownership separation, where you have different owners, separate ownership of transmission and other activities in the electricity value chain, and then they're not being the same ownership. You would expect that the transmission system operator would be able to act and to behave more independently. So, as I said, these are different formats. It may also be stages in a process. In Europe, we started with accounting separation in the late 90s, and then we achieved ownership separation in 2009, even though there are still exceptions for those companies or those groups which are vertically integrated at that time. They can still retain some level of ownership, cross ownership, but then they have to implement strict compliance programs with respect to, for example, management separation and Chinese walls. So, you know, it can be seen as different model, but also as steps in a process. I don't think, you know, you're probably more expert than I have on what is a transmission system operator's missions. I think the point to be made here, and I think Ignacio has already referred to it, is that the transmission system operator doesn't need to own the transmission assets, the transmission lines. If it is a transmission system operator, then you know, it as a definition of transmission system operator, usually it means that it not only operates the system but also owns the transmission assets. But there are other variants. For example, the independent system operator that doesn't need to own the assets. In general, it doesn't own the assets, and therefore it only operates the transmission system using assets which are owned by the transmission owners. So these are the three or the four possible models for operating the transmission system. The vertical integrated utility, which was a legacy model, which is still the model in place in many jurisdictions. So there is nothing wrong with it, unless you want to introduce competition. If you want to introduce competition generation, then the issues that I raised beforehand about the level playing field between different actors then come into play. And then you have, as I said, three models: the full ownership unbundling model, the independent system operator model, and the independent transmission operator model or transmission owner model. And I will come to them in turn and to see what they are. Now, this is the legacy model. There is a vertically integrated undertaking covering all segments in the provision of electricity. Here, I did not include distribution because it's a bit, it's not very relevant, but there would be also a distribution level there. But basically, there is generation and then a transmission system operator and then distribution and supply. And then you could have, possibly, you could have some competing supplier and competing generators in there. The issue in this traditional model, there are two issues. First, what can generators, independent generators and independent supplier do, from where, to whom they can sell electricity and from where they can buy electricity respectively? And secondly, which are the terms and conditions under which they can access the transmission system if the system is still fully controlled by a vertically integrated utility, having itself generation and supply activities, competing with independent generators and independent supply. So this was the first, this is a traditional model. At the end of the spectrum, as in terms of unbundling, is the ownership unbundled transmission system operator, which own and operate the assets, the transmission assets. So this is the fully separate. At that point, vertically integrated undertaking is no longer different from independent entrants, independent generators and supplier. It would retain the generation and the supply business as, new entrants as generators and supply would have. And this is actually the neater form of separation. It's not the only one, and it's not necessary to, in order to promote competition, but it's, as I said, it's probably the simplest one in terms of regulation. Maybe not politically the simplest one to achieve. Sorry. So here, sometimes there is the issue of, the public sector wanting to retain ownership of the vertically integrated utility and of the TSO. And I think practice has shown that as long as the TSOs and the other under part of the former vertically integrated utility are controlled by different ministry, this is not necessarily a problem. It's obviously a somewhat lesser form of unbundling, but still workable. And here, maybe I don't need to go through. This is the sort of constraint that we have in Europe regarding the separation. So it's it's ensured that the same people do not control or on a transmission system operator and on assets or companies undertaking generation and supply business. And so these are legal definition, but the idea is that the ownership should be separate, and there should be no entity that has a control function on both the TSO and the remaining part of the vertically integrated utility, or for what matters, any other company operating generation or supply. So the second model is to which I think Ignacio referred beforehand, is the independent system operator. The independent system operator does not own the assets. The assets remain in the ownership of vertically integrated utility, or there could be other owners, historic owners, and the independent system operator, which is ownership unbundling itself, unbundled itself, only operate the system using the assets, as I said, the lines and the stations, etc., owned by the transmission owners. This is also a model, a possible model. Here, the ISO would be typically responsible for granting and managing third-party access, would be subject to the same unbundling requirement that the TSO under the ownership unbundling. So it would have to be strongly separated from any other company. Should have at its disposal the request financial, technical and physical and human resources to carry out its task, but it's clearly a much smaller company than a TSO, because it doesn't have to necessarily do the maintenance, for example, of the assets, even though in some jurisdictions I understand that this is required. And it should develop a plan on a longer term, because then it's a matter of who is responsible for developing the network, because the ISO itself would not directly develop the network. It would instruct other parties to develop the network. So this is what an ISO is about. And under this model, also the transmission owners, which are retaining the ownership of the assets, even though they're not managing the system, also are expected to perform some tasks and to take some actions. And here you have a list of, and they should, for example, finance investments, because they would then eventually own the assets, but then it could also be the new assets could also be developed by new owners. So here you separate the action of system operation and transmission ownership. And this is a model that I'll come to later on as to what is where this model could make sense, or at least what the purpose could be, the purpose of this model vis-a-vis the more integrated one. And then in Europe, we've also invented this independent transmission operator model, and this was trying to address the political issues of some countries not wanting to have their vertically integrated utilities surrendering the transmission system operation function. And then this model is basically maintaining a vertically integrated group, but ring-fencing the transmission system operators with a number of requirements. As I said, it's a very complex system, and it has been, I would say, almost completely abandoned when it comes to the electricity side of the business, because there would be a lot of compliance requirement obligation for the ITO, which is still within vertically integrated utilities. And then also the financing of the ITO would need to be carefully looked into, because obviously you don't want the vertically integrated utility to interfere with the way in which the ITO operates through its financing. For example, making the financing contingent to the fact that the ITO develop the network in one place rather than another, in order to favor or discriminate in favor of the activities, the generation activities of the vertically integrated utility. Now, as I was saying, in Europe, the most popular or the most frequent model is the ownership unbundled model, which and then you have a number of ITO models, and the ISO has been very successful. Is very complex, and but in other parts of the world, in the US, for example, in Latin America, it's been quite a successful model. It's in Europe. It's not that it's not been successful; it's that it's not been chosen by many countries for diverse reasons. This is the situation at the moment in the US. And you also have RTOs, which are basically independent system operators at the regional level. And here the region means covering more than one state. And as you say, you have some ISOs, for example, the one in California or the one in Texas, that are single state ISO, but they don't own the transmission facilities. They just operate them. They just operate the system, and then you have other ISOs which cover more than one state, US state, and therefore they're sort of termed regional transmission organizations, but they're still ISO with a larger geographical footprint. So when do you want, or when would an ISO model be justified? And instead of, for example, the simpler independent transmission system operator, the ownership and bundles system operation. Well, I can see a number of reasons. Maybe there are more, but this is what I've observed in practice. there may be the objective of maintaining a plurality of transmission asset owners, especially if you have this plurality to start with, and then you don't want to strip some of the transmission asset owner of their ownership of the transmission assets, but you want to introduce competition, and therefore, in a sense, you need to create an independent system of operators. Whether you want to introduce competition in the development of new transmission network elements, and therefore you can do that by saying, when a new line is needed, we put it out for competition, and that might result in more than one transmission asset owner. Now, in this respect, I think one needs to consider that the same results in terms of competitive pressure could be obtained by not tendering the construction of the line to different transmission owners or future transmission owners. You can just tender out the construction of the line to construction companies and then retain the common ownership. At the end of the day, the two models or the two approaches might lead to very similar outcomes. So you can still have competition in constructing lines without ending up with different owners for the new lines. I think it's a slightly different matter if you are not, rather than looking at the construction of new line, you look at the construction or the of addressing system needs, which is a more general definition, and which may or may not involve constructing new physical capacity, may also involve having other ways of running the system. There, I think maybe the competition between construction companies clearly doesn't work, and that then it's more a matter of a regulatory approach. But this is maybe a new requirement, for which there is very little tradition. We're just completing at the Florence School a survey of Europe and other main jurisdictions, and there are basically no regulatory approaches that seems to be serving this purpose. And then, when you are liberalizing a sector in a country, there may be difficulties of stripping the transmission asset ownership from the incumbent. So you want to privatize the incumbent, the vertically integrated monopoly, is quasi-monopoly of the incumbent, but you do not have the political will to separate the transmission asset ownership, and therefore you privatize it, but then at least you enucleate the transmission system operation function, which has a very low asset value. Basically, it's just a bunch of computer and maybe a control center. It doesn't have the asset value of the transmission network, and that makes probably the political process somewhat easier. Now, there is sometimes a dimension, as I said, of this. There is a regional dimension. Already mentioned the case of the US, where you have multi-state regional transmission organization. And that could also be a reason for implementing an independent system operators, because in that way you could operate a regional system or a multi-jurisdictional system without needing to, in a consistent way, without needing to merge the TSOs, which sometimes is politically difficult and complex. And this could be achieved in different ways. I mean, the US, as I mentioned, they went for a regional ISO, so the regional transmission organizations. In Europe, we are not yet there. There is a lot of opposition about creating a European ISO, and therefore what happened was the creation of regional coordination centers. And it's interesting because the TSOs have been very careful to ensure through the lobbying, I would say, in the legislative process, that the regional coordination centers do not get anywhere near real-time operations. So they're more sort of coordinating the planning, both preparing, network development planning, preparing and sharing maintenance planning, etc. So they stop ahead of real-time. When it comes to real-time, the responsibility is still very much jurisdictional within a country. with a TSO running the system. Then what are the challenges to regulate the ISO? Because the ISO would still need to be regulated. It doesn't have assets, but it still performs a very important function. Ignacio mentioned the fact that the cost of transmission system operation with respect to the total cost of supplying electricity is usually a minor share, typically between 5–7%, something like that. But if the system is operated in an inappropriate way, it could create cost, for example, of generating electricity, which are much, much higher. And we've seen, for example, redispatching costs or costs related to congestion being, inefficient dispatching can be much more costly. So it is important to regulate the system operation, irrespective of whether it's under the same ownership of the assets or not. One of the issues with transmission system operators, so the same company owning and operating the system, has been the risk of gold plating. So the transmission system operator pretending that it needs to build more than is strictly necessary. And this has been partly because their business is about building and being rewarded, remunerating for building and maintaining the system, partly because a larger system, a stronger system, makes operating the system easier and reduces the risk of the transmission system operators. And then, as any entity, clearly the lower the risk, the easier the life, and the better the performance. So I'm not saying that this should be surprising or it is wrong. Is intrinsic in the nature of the transmission system operator that they would like to have, they would like to oversize the transmission system, and part of it is a prudent strategy, and part of it is probably might be considered as excessive. Now, an independent ISO could make dealing with potential gold plating easier, because then you have the planning of for example, the development of the network performed by a separate entity than the owner of the network. So this entity, the ISO, would have less incentive. I wouldn't say that it has no incentive, but it would have less incentive to overbuild. The incentive that it will still have is that because it will still be responsible for operating the system, and a stronger system is easier to operate. It operates more far inside its limits. And because the operation of the system would be the responsibility of the ISO would be tempted to plan a bit more than strictly necessary. But at least it would not have the incentive from the remuneration of the assets, which is the other part of the incentive, or the capex buyer, as it's been referred to in regulatory dialogues, the capex buyers of the transmission system operators. The problem in regulating the ISO is that the regulated ISO does not have assets. I mean, it has a very low capitalization. As I mentioned, it's probably a control center, computing systems, etc. It doesn't own lines and large physical assets, and therefore it's more difficult to design incentives. Usually incentives are based on premium and penalties, and premium and penalties means higher return or lower return. Now, the system operator an independent system operator, an ISO, does not have the financial strength, could not have the financial strength to be able to withstand large penalties if it does underperform. So this is a challenge. You can go around it, but you could have incentives and penalty for the management, etc. But the traditional way of regulating in the transmission system is not available for the independent system operator. That's something to be taken into account. And then my final my final considerations is about the role of transmission system development in the context of regional market. And as I said, the planning could be done at a regional level, could be done either by a regional ISO when a regional ISO is available, or through cooperation of national ISOs or TSOs. Now, the issue, and I think Ignacio has alluded to it, but I'm sorry I was late, but I don't think he got into this. The issue is that cost, when you look at an asset at regional level, for example, to increase the integration of different jurisdictions, cost and benefit may accrue differently. So benefits may accrue more to one country, while the cost may accrue more on another company. I mean, in the past, and I think still now, in most jurisdictions, costs are allocated on the based on the territorial principle, which means that whoever, every jurisdiction builds and pay for the lines that insist on their territory. And if that's the case, the cost allocation is determined in this way. And then if benefits accrue in a different way, some jurisdiction may not see the benefit of building a new line. And this may be a problem because a line may be overall beneficial if the whole regional system is considered. But then there may be some jurisdictions that see things differently if they focus on cost and benefit of their jurisdiction. So a jurisdiction may have, according to the traditional approach, territorial approach, more cost than the benefit that it feels the new line could have. One example, for example, I mean, probably the most extreme example is one line internal to one jurisdiction, which however solves congestion in another jurisdiction. Clearly, the jurisdiction within which the line needs to be built see very little benefits, but according to the territorial principle, it would have to cover the whole cost, but the benefits would accrue to another one. So I think it's important also to take this aspect into account, and if a project is overall beneficial for the region as a whole, and which means that it delivers benefits in excess of the cost once you consider the region as a whole, then there is an allocation of cost which makes all jurisdictions in that region benefiting. So the benefits exceeding the cost for each and all jurisdictions in that region. The issue is how you achieve that results. We know that the results is achievable, we know that the results is feasible, how you achieve it. And in Europe, we've developed a process where a European regulator is involved, or an entity which is almost a European regulator is involved. If the various jurisdictions fails to agree on allocation of costs that would deliver benefits to everybody, other regions may take different directions, but I think this aspect should be taken into account, because with the increased penetration of renewables, power flows on the system may change quite substantially. Reinforcement in the system are required. Regional cooperation is required, and regional connectivity is required to absorb the variability of many renewable-based generation plant. And then the issue of reinforcement of cross-border lines, or lines that affect more than just one jurisdiction, come up. And then sometimes these developments are blocked by the fact that cost and benefit do accrue in a corresponding manner. So that's all I had to say. Again, apologies for being late, and happy to take questions or hear comments and for discussion.
Thank you so much, Alberto. I think that was very insightful and very helpful. And I'm very glad to have you present the last of this series of workshops that we're having. Yeah, as Alberto said, I'd like to open up for questions or comments from anybody in the room. So if you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand.
Sorry, Mike, mine is just a comment. I think for the first time, I've really been puzzling with this idea of which one is better between an independent system operator or having a TSO that is independent or one that is not independent. And for the first time, thanks to Alberto and thanks to this presentation, I've been able to see the actual benefits of having an independent system because of those benefits of probably when you have a separate owner, you like based on what Alberto has told us, is that you'll be able to get, to go into a competitive market for the development of this of the transmission assets, the lines and everything. So for the first time, it's just a comment. Just wanted to say that there are a lot of benefits, and probably to Alberto, he can also tell us in areas where, especially in Europe, where the system operator also owns the assets, whether they are. But of course, we know they also operate a different dispatch model as opposed to the ISOs in the US, whereby the ISOs in the US have a centralized dispatch, but the TSOs in Europe have a decentralized form of dispatch. So probably you can try and compare and contrast those two in terms of especially in terms of the development. Although I also understand that in Europe the system is so interconnected and so developed in a way that probably it doesn't need further development, so to speak. I don't know.
Okay, maybe. No, indeed, the US and the European models are different, and I think they come from different perspectives of the system. The market in the US has been very much based. Sorry, the market in the US is a more physical market. For example, the geographical structure of the market is a nodal structure, which try to incorporate into the market a lot more of the physics of the network. And the market is run by the ISOs because they are the only one who has the full knowledge of the network, the full network modeling capabilities, or at least this is what they have. In Europe, we've taken a different approach. In Europe, typically, the market operator is a different entity from the transmission system operator. And this is, this is possible because the geographical structure of the market in Europe is mostly zonal, where the zones are an aggregation of nodes that in some countries are as big, in some cases are as big as a country. France, Germany, Spain, Poland, and in other countries are a subset of the node of the country. Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Italy, where a zone is, Italy has 7 zones, Norway's, I think they have 5, Denmark 2, and Sweden 4. So, but in any case, each zone is an aggregation of nodes. So the market operates on a model of the European transmission system, which is an approximation, an aggregation of the true model. In the US, no, the market is run at the nodal level. So I would say that in most countries, as you've seen before in the map, the TSO model operates. I actually was directly involved in Italy. I was working at that time for the transmission system operator when at liberalization, as I said, it was politically difficult to strip the vertically integrated company, Enel, of the ownership of the transmission network. So at liberalization in at the end of the 90s, an independent system operator was established, basically to run a system which was 99% owned by the same company, by the formal incumbent, the former vertically integrated company, because it was difficult at privatization to split the transmission assets from the rest of the vertically integrated company. There was opposition from everywhere, including the trade unions, etc. 5 years later, the transmission assets were joined with the system operation, with the establishment of transmission system operator, because it was seen that the ISO model is just more complicated, and unless you have a good reason to have it, it's not worth it. And the good reason could be political difficulties, the fact that you have several owners of private owners of the transmission system, and it's difficult to strip them of the ownership. I mean, any legal system finds it difficult to strip owners of their ownership. So there are some reasons, why you might need or want to opt for independent system operators. But in general, if you don't have constraints of this type, the TSO seems to be the sort of best, the best solution. In Europe, is the discussion of whether to establish a European ISO has never emerged strongly. Sometimes, it's discussed, but we all know that, for example, an European TSO would be possible, because taking the ownership of the asset from the national TSO and put them in a single company in Europe is just a non-starter. While a European ISO is at the moment facing a lot of opposition, but is a concept that at least can be considered. Is a technically feasible concept, not necessarily a political feasible concept. So there are situations where we probably want to go for the ISO, but otherwise, in general, the TSO model seems to be a much simpler one.
But how does the TSO deal with the issue of conflict of interest? Because if you own the assets, like you say, that the issue of the issue of access, and also the issue of discrimination in access, and also the distortion, because you'll be wanting to if you're also the dispatcher, you'll be wanting to route the power through the transmission lines that you own or are owned by affiliates. So how do they deal with that issue of conflict of interest?
Now, here I'm talking about an independent transmission system operator. So a company which has nothing to do with the other companies in the sector. Its ownership separated, and therefore it has no interest in generation and supply. It's like a referee, if you want. And at that point, the referee should be neutral, I would say, by definition. I'm not talking about a transmission system operator which is still within a company that also owns generation and supply, and then there is an issue of how you ensure non-discrimination vis-a-vis competitors of the generation and supply businesses of the same group. But in the model that we have in Europe, and in the typical TSO model, the TSO is independent of any other activities in the sector. Some people would say that it should also be independent from distribution companies, but there I see, there the reason for this to me is less obvious. But for sure, it should be independent from generation and supply, and then you don't have, you shouldn't have conflict of interest. And typically, transmission tariffs do not, should not, and I think Ignacio made the point beforehand, should not. So the allowed revenues for a transmission order should not depend on the amount of power that it's that uses the network, because the costs do not depend. Losses is different, but losses are not transmission costs per se, Ignacio would say. But when it comes to infrastructure cost, these do not depend on how much power is using the network. So I think that part of distortion is probably not there anyway. But what I refer to is an independent transmission system operator, and that you know, if it's really independent, you don't have any, you shouldn't have any fear of distorting the system. You have other challenges, you know, making sure that it develop the system in the most effective way, that it does not still overbuild, that it looks for innovative solutions to system needs. There are other challenges, but not of this. You shouldn't have challenges in terms of making sure that it does not distort competition in generation and supply.
Okay. One more clarification, and sorry for having to speak so much. Yeah, at some point you mentioned that the ISOs in the US, they are physical in terms of physics, and also they do the market operation function. Is that correct?
It is correct. They operate the market. PJM and others, they operate the market.
So they both dispatch and operate, and also does the market operation, basically running the day-ahead market and everything.
They run the market. There is usually a 5-minute market, and it is run by PGM. Yes, it is.
Okay, thank you.
I mean, there is no issue. I mean, I think in Europe we decided a different avenue for historic reasons, I think. And partly because probably the system is more meshed, even though we've seen over time that there are still internal constraints within European zones which are as severe as the constraint that we have between zones. So I think, you know, the system is now been, I mean, the geographical structure of the European system is now being put to the test, whether it's and also there was in Europe something which I'm not sure was ever an issue in the US, a political imperative of having a single electricity price for all consumers in a country or in an area, I would say in a country. And that was obviously facilitated by the fact that the country was a single zone. There were no nodal differentiation to the extent possible. I'm not sure this is still a major concern, but in the past it was.
Thank you for the great discussion and conversation. I do want to acknowledge that we are at the end of our official time, but before we end, I do want to make sure that there are any final questions or comments from anybody else in the room for Alberto.
And happy to stay a bit longer because I was late. So if there are further questions, don't hesitate.
Appreciate that.
But apparently not.
Okay, probably you can try to make a clear distinction between. You said ISO has got a nodal system, and the TSOs have got a zonal, whereby they're aggregated by nodes. So I don't know what's the difference between a zonal system versus a nodal system.
Sorry, then I was not clear. Is the market structure that can be nodal or zonal? System operation is necessarily nodal, in the sense that, you know, system operation is about the physics of electricity, the physics of the system, and there is no cheating on that. You know, the system operation is very physical, and it has to cope with the physical reality of the network. And that's one thing. And this is operated in the US by the ISO, in Europe mostly by TSOs, in some cases by ISOs. And then there is the organization of the market, of trading, of price discovery, okay, which is a separate activity, which is receiving bids and determine the clearing price, clearing the market. And then clearly, when you run a market, you have to run a market being aware of what is physically feasible and not. For example, you cannot allow or admit trading between locations in the network which are not physically connected, or where the physical connection is limited. You cannot allow trading beyond what the physical limits are, because that's not feasible. So then the issue is how you incorporate the physical limitation of the network into the trading, into the market. I mean, this is, how you do it has to do with congestion management, and it would take probably a session of its own. But the starting point is to see what geographical structure the market, you want the market to have. So whether the market should incorporate all the physical constraints of the network. And then if you want that, then you need to have a nodal structure of the market, because this is the way in which the network is physically run. Or whether you're content to have a simplified geographical structure of the network. And therefore, for example, if you have a set of nodes within which capacity is sufficient to deal with any foreseeable pattern of flows, then you can say, okay, these nodes we can aggregate in a zone, because it's unlikely that there would be congestion between these nodes. And therefore, we just simplify, and rather than having, 50 nodes, we have just one node, which is a zone. And then the physical model underlying trading it becomes a simplified one where, the nodes are replaced by zones. And zones, as I said, in Europe, can be as big as a country. That leads to the question: is now clear what it means when I refer to zonal versus? It's not about system operation; it's about market, right? Is that clear?
Yes, it's clear.
Okay. Then the next issue, maybe this is my last comment on this, but happy, as I said, to go on the whole afternoon if you want, is whether the assumption underlying the zone, which means that the capacity within a zone is sufficient to handle all foreseeable patterns of flow within this zone, whether that assumption is valid or not, and whether it remains valid with a change in flow patterns which are due to the increased penetration of renewables. And this is a big if. And this, therefore, has to do with the nodal configuration of this zonal configuration of the system. In Europe, for example, I don't think it's a secret to anyone. We have a major problem in Germany, not only in Germany, but also in Germany, because Germany at the moment is a single zone. There is a lot of wind generation in the north, a lot of load in the south, in Bavaria, and the system between the north and the south is not strong enough. For political reason, Germany has always been considered as a single zone because they want to have a single price, etc. But this setting is being increasingly challenged by the fact that the assumption underlying the market geographical structure does not hold any longer, and the underlying network is not such that all reasonable and any expected flow within Germany could be accommodated by the German network. So these assumptions need to be tested and continue to be tested. And my rule of thumb, when I had to design in the early 2000s the Italian system, which we designed with 6 zones, and now a 7th one has been created, was in doubt, you split. You split, one zone in more zones, because if you do like this, the worst that can happen is that the zones would have the same price if there is, no congestion. But if there is congestion, and this congestion is within a zone because you have not split it, then you don't have economic ways of dealing with it. You have to redispatch, and that may be quite costly. So in doubt, if you don't know whether you want to have one zone or two zones, in doubt, do split. This would be my recommendation. And then the market will tell you whether you're right or wrong. But even if you were wrong, not a big deal.
Thank you for your questions, Patrick. Before we close, let's take one more question from Philip. I see your hand up.
Oh, yes. Thanks a lot. Yeah, so I just had a question mostly mostly in relation to the operation of TSO and ISO, the aspects of network security. In an event where you have an ISO, you tend to have a lot of players on the market, and some transmission lines or key points of interconnection will be owned by different companies. So how would you guarantee, like, how do ISOs mostly, or just if maybe there could be recommendations on how an independent ISO would probably guarantee security of supply in an event of a commercial dispute where you don't want that aspect to be, the security of supply to be compromised anyway, despite any commercial challenges due to maybe anything else. So how does that work in an ISO model?
Well, you can do that contractually or through incentives. The regulator should set incentives, for example, for the availability of the assets. And contractually, the assets would have to be available to the ISO or available for being managed by the ISO. So clearly, that is, it's feasible. As I said, it's a mixture of contracts and incentives. The same incentives that you can give to the TSO, even though with the TSO, you have easier performance target or more relevant performance targets. Because with the ISO model, you still have to define whose responsibility it is if something went wrong. With the TSO, it's a TSO responsibility. So it's easier to set targets, performance targets to which you can associate incentives. But it's also possible with the ISO model. As I said, you have partly based contracts or licenses and partly through incentives to have the assets available, for example, to have the maintenance coordinated by the ISO. So it's feasible. And it has been done, as I said, in Europe and in the US and in other places. I think it's not, honestly, I think when it comes to the day-to-day, it's not a big, you can achieve the same standards. With the ISO, it's a bit more complex than with the TSO because it involves more entities. But I think by now there is experience that allows achieving the same standards. It's just a more complex setting. And unless there is a good reason, why go for more complexity?
Thank you, Philip, for that question. Did you have a follow-up, Philip?
I don't know. Thanks. No, I just wanted to acknowledge that. Thanks for the recommendations.
Great. Any other final questions from our participants? I do want to respect everyone's time, so I think maybe this is a good place to close. I want to thank you so much, Alberto, for providing your presentation, and your wealth of knowledge, I'm sure is deeply appreciated. And I know Ignacio is not here anymore, but we appreciate his comments earlier on. So thank you so much for providing those comments and presentation. I also want to thank every participant for coming to this workshop, as our previous ones as well. And finally, thank you to Mosonda and ZESCO for your partnership in this series, as well as with the Southern African Power Pool and RERA. I think the collaboration on these series of workshops has been fantastic, and I look forward to working with you again. And thanks so much to my colleague, Isabel McCann from NREL, for supporting me through these workshops, handling the Zoom and logistics. So appreciate your help on this. All right, I think we will close here. Thanks everyone for joining, and have a good day.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.